The federal Constitution says almost nothing about voting or the right to vote. There's only one office in the U.S. Constitution for which popular elections are mandated, and that's for members of the House of Representatives. And what the framers did was to leave it to the states until there are a series of interventions by the federal government in the form of constitutional amendments.
Understand the dilemma that the founding fathers were in. The reason they didn't come up with a uniform system of qualifications, the reason they didn't even put in a right to vote in the Constitution, was because it was just simply impractical, given the diversity of the states at the time.
All of the states, when they were colonies, already had voter eligibility laws. They had suffrage requirements of one sort or another, and they varied very substantially from one state to the other.
And no state wanted to give up their way of voting. I mean, it's like, the best way to vote is Virginia's way. No, Rhode Island has the best way to vote. No, we understand, it's New York. It's New York who votes best, so we'll do it New York's way.
The reason we didn't federalize any aspect of the political process other than the formalities of we have a Congress and what the elections are and things of that sort is the slave question. The fear was that a strong federal government would, either through legislation or perhaps then it was much more remote, through judicial decree, somehow intercede in the internal life of the states. And so the compromise that was created, and it really was a compromise, was the Three-Fifths Compromise, which recognized the number that would be associated with the slaves, but gave no rights of the franchise to anybody. So this is a major constitutional void. It's something that looks odd compared to all modern constitutions, but like all constitutions, it reflects the political realities of the time in which it was enacted.
What they were fearful of, if they adopted any one standard, was that there would be some state or states that did not ratify the Constitution because they objected to the voting qualifications. So a quite momentous decision was made early on, which was to separate citizenship, which remained the province of the federal government, from voting and voting rights, which were left to the state. And that decision was made, again, not because of any high theory, but because of the pragmatic politics of constitutional ratification in the late 1780s.
So we don't have one electoral system in this country. We have 51 electoral systems in this country. And every one of them is just a little bit different.
When the nation is first formed, I mean, even during the Revolutionary period, but even after the Constitution is written and the state constitutions are written, in most places, the people who were permitted to vote were white, not exclusively, but in most states, white, male property owners. The kind of property they could own in some states was in the form of land, or what's called real property. Some places there were sort of dollar equivalents that were specified. But you did have to own property just about everywhere in order to vote. One notable exception to this pattern is that in New Jersey, for a brief period, both African Americans and women were allowed to vote. But New Jersey shut down the voting of people besides white males early in the 19th century.
Drawing on English traditions, the belief was that to vote, you had to have a stake in society.
That if you owned property, you had an interest in good government and in the outcomes of policies that you did not have if you did not own property. That was the argument. But there were two other arguments that ran alongside it and that partially contradicted each other. One was a fear that men who did not own property could be organized and manipulated by demagogues of one sort or another. The other fear, which is very present and it slips out in the articulation, runs in the opposite direction, which is a fear that if the propertyless could vote, they might vote to take away the advantages of people who own property.
That was the fear in the Constitutional Convention, that if the poor ever mobilized around their interests, they would expropriate the rich.
What they were worried about were people whose vote could be bought. Bought by necessity, bought by need of a job, bought by food, bought because of the dominance of a husband or a father. And so these were the reasons why women and the propertyless and those who were in trades, in other words, working people, that they were denied the vote.
So there's a clear class dimension to this and class apprehensions. And indeed, class apprehensions, concerns about poor people voting and the poorest of people voting run throughout U.S. history and shape the voting laws in the United States from the 1780s to the present.
But even at the beginning, the ideals of the revolution began to challenge this idea that only property-owning white men could vote. In Pennsylvania, where they had a real revolution, Ben Franklin was in charge of writing the new Constitution, and it expanded the right to vote to men without property for the first time. It was the most radical constitution in the world.
Franklin, who is the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention and probably the most progressive, and he in a number of ways, not just at the convention, but in dealing with the Pennsylvania state government and elsewhere, had been for a very expansive right to vote, and he was opposed to property requirements. And he told the story, and he told the story clearly more than once. Suppose a man wants to meet a property requirement and is allowed to use the value of his farm animals to meet that property requirement. Farm animals were very valuable at the time. They were a key form of capital. So he goes to vote and he brings his jackass with him as proof that he owns the property requisite to vote. And he does vote. And then 2 years later, there's another round of elections. And he goes to vote, but he's not allowed to vote because the jackass has died and he no longer can meet the property requirement. And then Franklin ends the story by saying, so in whom is the right to vote vested? In the man or in the jackass?
The Pennsylvania government hired, as its basically chief propagandist, Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine had come to the United States after a failed career as a rope maker and corset maker in England. Within a year, he'd written Common Sense, which said not only let's have independence, but let's break with monarchy. It was really not a common sense idea, it was a radical idea. And Thomas Paine began to argue, too, for expanding the suffrage. People understood the connection between the ideals of common sense, of the Declaration of Independence, and the idea that you needed to kind of begin to move towards a democracy. Up in Massachusetts, John Adams reflected a different view. He wrote Massachusetts' Constitution, and he was urged, hey, why don't you do the same thing that they did in Pennsylvania? Why don't you end that property requirement? And John Adams was aghast. He said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of 18 will demand the right to vote. Men who hath not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, he said, and they will demand the right to vote. He added, there will be no end of it.
Well, the franchise has always been limited in all of human history. It's limited today. We don't let children vote. We don't let immigrants vote. I think the most distinctive thing about the United States was that right from the beginning, the franchise was broader here than it had ever been before. It's easy to look back and say, well, they had property requirements. It was only white males in most places, but you have to avoid being acontextual.
We don't want everyone to vote. We've never wanted everyone to vote. That's not the point of American democracy. What we want are the right people to vote. We want the right-thinking people to vote, who understand American society and not simply sell their vote to the highest bidder. And the question is, well, how do you exclude the ones that you fear are a threat to that? Well, one way you do it is you continue to exclude people you deem dependent. That means women, that means children, that means African Americans, that means Native Americans. But the other way is you begin to limit who can vote as a white male by requiring citizenship. And so you've come over from abroad, and we're saying, it's going to be 5-6 years before you're a citizen, before we can trust you with the power that is the vote. So at the same time that we're expanding the range of who can vote, we're also looking for ways to narrow it to exclude those we are worried about, who we don't really want to vote. And that's been part of history ever since.